going to give folks another minute or so to join us. Thanks to Kazutaka Kuroda, who's behind the scenes setting this all up. This is the first time we'll have done a webinar as the network without Concordia University in Montreal, who's off for the summer. We'll be resuming with them this fall. So you know, this will be a great opportunity. One quick thing: if anyone is not on mute, please do hit mute, or we'll be muting you to make sure there isn't a great degree of background noise. I'm hearing a few things as we speak. Anyway, so but I think Kazutaka will be muting you if you're not muted. At any rate, so without further ado, with great thanks to Nick, who's in the middle of his efforts with Simon and UNEP and Occam Steiner, performing this inquiry into the design of a sustainable financial system, something that you know, obviously as a network we're very happy to see being brought to a very high level. So the purpose of today is to get from Nick how they're doing, what they've done, what they'd like to do, really to get a state of this inquiry. So Nick, assuming you're still with us, over to you if we could for an overview.
Thanks very much, Kerry, and thanks to everybody for joining this webinar. It's great to be reaching out to the network, obviously the work that participants in the network, and I'm pleased to be a member myself, have been really important in showing how you can have a prosperous sort of financial sector that does help drive economies towards a long-term focus on sustainable development. So as Kerry said, I'm one of the two co-directors which is leading the inquiry into the design of a sustainable financial system. I have a few slides with me which will hopefully outline for you the purpose of what we're doing, the approach of what we're taking. And this is a very timely opportunity for us because we just launched our first output, which is explicitly designed as an invitation to seek the contributions of stakeholders in different groups in different parts of the world into our work. That is all available on the website. It's all translated into the 6 UN languages. And I'll close my presentation this afternoon with just sort of highlighting to you some of the sort of key questions that we're really seeking guidance from experts from around the world. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So really just some sort of overall thoughts for you on is actually why we see the inquiry as an opportunity for change. Many of us have been working on the interface between finance and sustainable development for a number of years. And I think there is growing recognition that reforms within the financial system are a necessary part of the solution if we're going to rapidly scale up capital for a green and inclusive economy. That these interventions in terms of the rules of the game, the policies, regulations, incentives and standards that govern the financial market, the financial system, these are complements rather than substitutes for smart action in the real economy. So our starting point is clearly you need mechanisms such as a price on carbon, clearly you need measures to scale up mass transit within rapidly growing urban centres, but also you need to address perhaps some of the market failures within the financial system itself if we're going to deliver the scale and the pace of change that we all know we need to deliver. I think what is interesting, and I'll hopefully illustrate this as I go through, that we do see around the world examples of what we could call financial policy innovation in different sectors. At the moment, we see those as somewhat fragmented. So there are interesting examples in the banking sector in developing countries of what could be called green credit guidelines. We have quite a lot of progress within the securities world in terms of things such as the Sustainable Stock Exchange, but there isn't really a sort of holistic overview of all these various initiatives. And we would say that the time is ripe for looking at how we can combine financial with long-term sustainability. Clearly, we are standing in the wake of a major financial crisis. I think this has brought openness within the financial policy community to how the financial system serves the real economy and how it is also linked to pressing issues of the day such as inequality and also environmental sustainability. And a quote at the bottom of that slide from Christine Lagarde, I think, highlights the authority of people who are highlighting the need for financial system reform. So we could go to the third, next slide. Just to go through the inquiry's aim and approach, the inquiry was launched in January this year by Achim Stein, the Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme and Under Secretary General of the UN as a whole, and really to see whether we could pull together an agenda around financial market reform and sustainable development, identifying that potentially there was a gap in the policy arena on this, and that this was something that we could, working with others, usefully pull together. We have a 2-year mandate, and we will complete our work by the end of 2015. Clearly, this is a very exciting time for international policy work on sustainable development. We have the Sustainable Development Goals process going through. We have the negotiations for a new climate agreement ending in Paris next year. And we have other related processes, for example, on disaster risk reduction. Our goal, our aim, is to identify and advance policy options that would deliver a step change in this financial system's effectiveness in mobilizing capital for a green and inclusive economy. So looking at both the environmental and social dimensions. In terms of our sort of priorities and what we're looking at is to develop some analytical frameworks. Some of those were included in our first background briefing, which we released last month, June. Secondly, very much and very important for us is country engagement to really understand what is happening at the national level in terms of policy innovation, what the urgent imperatives are, and what could be visions in different countries of a sustainable financial system. Clearly then there is a lot of thematic, cross-sectoral, cross-country work that needs to be done, whether that's on time horizons or incentives and so on. And then obviously we publish our options for policy next year. And clearly within that we want to enable learning, catalyze leadership hopefully, and also stimulate action. As many of you will realize, this is an area which is attracting increasing attention from senior financial policymakers, and again the quote at the bottom from Jim Kim, the President of the World Bank, was made at Davos this year, interestingly highlighting the role of financial regulators could be playing within the climate change arena and how they might start to want to address the systemic risk associated with carbon-intensive activities. So our approach is very much to play into this growing awareness within the financial policy and regulatory community and work in partnership with key agencies, including the World Bank. We are a small team in the inquiry, and we are very lucky to be guided by a great advisory council, people operating in their own capacity, and these are people generally from the financial system. So we have serving financial policymakers such as Maria Kiwanuka, who's the finance minister of Uganda, Atya Rahman, who's the governor of the central bank of Bangladesh. Sorry. We also have people maybe more from a sort of environmental, sustainable development policy perspective, such as Rachel Kite, the Group Vice President for Climate Change at the World Bank, Bruno Oberle, State Secretary at the Federal Office of Environment in Switzerland. Then also a series of sort of financial market practitioners, Nikki Newton-Kin, for example, CEO of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Delighted to have Anne Starspool, CEO of CalPERS in the US, and also Nenalal Kidwai, head of HSBC in India. And then a number of other players, Marilla Portugal with a distinguished career at the IMF, now the President of the Brazilian Bankers Federation, John Litsky, also from the IMF, Adair Turner, a former regulator and climate change policymaker in the UK, David Pitt-Watson, the co-chair of UNEP FI, UNEP being very important for us, a key coalition of organizations very closely linked to UNEP, obviously. So a great group of independently minded people who have agreed to lend their advice and their counsel to our work. And that has already served our projects very well. In terms of how we see the agenda on the next slide, slide 5, I think we see ourselves as being in a very important moment in time. And this triangle really sort of sets out, we see the sort of the triple challenge which we need to address. When we're thinking about the green inclusive economy, the green economy that many countries are working towards, whether that's in terms of green growth programs and so on, we see ourselves in some of the macro indicators that are still really heading in the wrong direction, and notable indicators around climate change and so on. I think in terms of green finance, we've seen a lot of focus in terms of trying to incentivize, to try and encourage investors to invest more in clean technology and green infrastructure and so on. But until now, really not very much focus on the rules of the game within the financial system. And then when you put financial reform, particularly within the post-crisis period, understandably a lot of focus on ensuring the stability and integrity of the financial system, but perhaps less so on its relationship to sustainable development. And that now is changing in a number of markets. So that's what we see as the triple challenge. On slide 6, this is our sort of way of trying to describe why we think taking a view and a focus on the system as a whole is potentially useful. And certainly, Carey, your work looking at the ownership of assets around the world has been very, very useful to show the need to think of the financial system as a whole. And this little diagram for us sort of typifies what we're looking at through the great work of people at Ceres and the IEA and others. We know we need at least around a clean trillion on average per year in additional incremental investment just for the low carbon transition. And that is in addition to around 5 trillion a year for underlying investment in buildings and industry, transport, and so on and so forth. This can seem a large sum of money, and indeed it is, and actually can be somewhat disempowering in policy discussions. But when we think that we have well over 225 trillion, the latest numbers I've seen from the IMF, upwards of 270 trillion within the world's financial system, this number can be put into perspective. And some of the issues I suppose we're looking at, and many of you have been working on for many years, is how do we look at some of the market imperfections, the market failures within the financial system in different parts of the world and different sectors, such as short-termism, such as perverse incentives, policy incoherence, narrow governance mandates, mismanaged risk, and information failures that are preventing the alignment of this broad mass of assets with the transition to a green and inclusive economy. On slide 7, one of the issues, obviously, when we look at the question of the financial system, is that this is not a planned system. It's a dynamic, constantly evolving system, and indeed there are many different systems around the world. Simply put, in terms of how we're looking at it, clearly you have the providers of funds, the sources of funds. You have obviously households, corporations, governments. You have banks in their credit creation role. You have the intermediation systems, capital markets playing an important part there, particularly in industrialized countries. And then you have obviously the uses of funds within the real economy. And what we're looking at in particular is particularly how the system is efficient in intermediating capital for a long-term sustainable economy, and how it is managing the risks that are arising from unsustainable management of resources. And as that little warning triangle highlights, this of course is a very simplistic understanding of the financial system, and that's one of the things we hope to communicate as we go through our work, and maybe in our outputs next year, is how we can actually visualize and understand the financial system. So but that's, I think, by way of prologue. Then I think on slide 8 is just sort of 3 rationales that we've come through, and we welcome your input on this, about why we should maybe consider intervening in terms of financial policy and regulation in the financial system to complement work that we might be wanting to deliver in terms of dealing with market failures in the real economy, whether that's energy systems, transport systems, or agriculture. And these are the three that we have identified in discussions with many policymakers and practitioners. First is there may well be systematic biases within the financial system that prevents a proper appreciation of sustainable development priorities. And particularly if we're thinking about future risks, issues such as climate change, clearly these have not been built into historic models, and therefore in many ways we know that financial practitioners can be underestimating the scale of the challenge. A second issue clearly for policymakers is the desire to achieve policy coherence, and I think there has been a concern, certainly in the wake of the financial crisis, that much needed reform to strengthen the stability of the financial system. Measures such as Basel III in banking and Solvency II in the European insurance sector could have unintended consequences on the supply of capital for long-term infrastructure. And that is clearly a concern of policymakers at the G20 level in terms of actually how do we mobilize capital for vital long-term infrastructure around the world. As I mentioned earlier, a total of at least 6 trillion a year on average needed through to 2030. And how do we make sure that we don't have unintended consequences of necessary policy measures to ensure stability? So that's the second concern. And the third is really where that actually financial policy interventions may just be more effective in terms of delivering capital. And I think this is a very strong theme that comes out of developing country practitioners. And the quote there on this page 8, it comes from Athiya Rahman, the central bank governor of Bangladesh I mentioned earlier. And I think this is very evocative of his approach to the link between financial monetary policy and sustainable development, is that as a central bank, his goal is to support the growth objectives of the Bangladesh government. The government's goals are pro-environment and inclusive from a social perspective, and therefore his mandate really is to see how his policies, whether it's financial regulation or monetary policy, can be aligned to those goals, which I think is a very fresh perspective, and that has led to the introduction of green credit guidelines, for example, in Bangladesh. At the bottom of that slide is a quote from Mark Burrows, Senior Managing Director from Credit Suisse in Asia Pac, and his perspective, again, as a long-term practitioner and investment banker in the sector, is I think this realization that in many ways we're not suffering from an absence of money. There is adequate money, but actually what we're lacking is perhaps the awareness and the political will to correct market failures within the financial system, and he's talking here about metrics, institutions, and policies. So that's very much the perspective we would come from. On slide 9, gives a sense of the scope. Clearly, the financial system or financial systems is a broad target to aim for in terms of policy analysis and reform. We have been sort of looking broadly in terms of policy, so the policies that public institutions can use to deliver the public interests, and these obviously can go from financial policy, can include hard financial regulation, a lot of interest increasingly on monetary policy post-crisis, both from a social and environmental perspective. We are focusing also on incentives, so financial sector fiscal measures. As we know, in many parts of the world, we have quite substantial fiscal incentives for savings, pensions, and investments, and in many cases, these have not been scrutinized from a sustainability perspective. We also do include private standards and standards which are developed by key gatekeepers in the system, whether that's accounting agencies or credit rating agencies. And to some extent, we're also looking at the question of policy-directed lending and priority lending schemes as well. The sort of, I suppose, the 4 sectors we're looking at, and more detail on what we found in our initial mapping is contained in our background briefing, which is on the website, looking at sort of banking, so the emergence of these green credit guidelines, how capital requirements link into the green agenda, green bond markets, and interest rates effects. In investment, clearly looking at questions of long-term duties, the evergreen issue of fiduciary duty, how do tax breaks play out, issues of benchmark. In the securities markets, both equities and bonds, clearly a lot of focus historically on disclosure and reporting. And then within insurance, actually, I think a very interesting work has been done on disaster risk reduction, the concerns about solvency, and then clearly, particularly in developing countries, extending access to insurance to deal with the risks of increasing natural catastrophes exacerbated by climate change. Clearly, much is going on. Slide 10, as many of us will know, we're seeing really a resurgence of market innovation around green and sustainable economic priorities, particularly in the bond market. And I was delighted to see that the Climate Bonds Initiative with HSBC reduced its recent state of the climate bonds market yesterday, and showing a substantial uplift in that. And so that is for us a very positive sign. I think that financial practitioners are focusing on market-based innovation on this. But on slide 11, we're also seeing, I think, policy innovation, which I've touched on in the past. And again, in those sort of four categories we're looking at. In terms of banking, really mostly in the developing countries, a number of countries, most recently Brazil, introducing soft law guidelines, or in the case of Brazil, central bank sort of regulation requiring banks to put in place effective environmental social risk systems, as well as also, in China's case, encouraging greater lending to low carbon priorities such as energy efficiency. Clearly in the securities world, we have quite a lot of work that's been done either through regulatory bodies such as the SEC in the US on climate change. The regulations came in there in 2009. We had in Australia earlier this year new stock exchange reporting requirements and a breakthrough in the European Union in terms of non-financial reporting. Clearly, as we've seen in many of these initiatives, the issue is not just having the guidelines and requirements, but ensuring that actually these are effectively implemented. So that's an area in terms of the effectiveness of these policies that we're very interested in examining. On investment, we've looked at this, many of us have been involved in this for a while. We have, I suppose, the granddaddy of these measures, the Pensions Act requirements in the UK. And interestingly, I think one of the most recent innovations was the proposed investor code in Malaysia, released by the Securities Commission of Malaysia, which would explicitly call for investors as part of their stewardship requirements to take account of sustainability factors. And insurance, perhaps, is where least work has been explicitly focused on sustainable development. Interesting developments from the National Association of Insurance Commissioners in the US, particularly being led in terms of implementation by state supervisors, such as in California. And it's interesting to note that the Prudential Regulatory Authority in the UK is now starting a process of research and consultation, looking at how climate change factors should impinge on its prudential regulatory mandate for the insurance sector. So this is what we see as a potentially interesting emerging landscape. Critical issues have not yet been addressed in terms of the effectiveness of these policies, the implementation issue I mentioned before, the sufficiency of these measures, and where other interventions could be made. So that's an area in terms we think we could help with. So then, in terms of what we plan to do, as I stressed at the beginning, we are a short-term initiative. We are seeking to work with a number of partners, both at the international level and the country level. And I think we're looking at sort of three broad areas of work. First is some framework pieces of analysis, developing scenarios, really to help us reveal blind spots in our minds. We know that sort of scenarios can be very helpful to do that. Starting to think about some principles which could guide this process of bringing together financial policy, regulations, sustainable development, and then an assessment framework. There are well-developed environmental impact assessment frameworks at the project and strategic level, They're also very well developed regulatory impact assessment frameworks, but we'd like to really see if we could apply those to this green finance development dimension. Then in terms of country engagement, as we said, that's really important for us. We don't want to be seen or act in a way that's seen as a sort of top-down UN initiative. We really want to engage with the often messy realities of practice at the country level. So focusing on the USA and Europe, China and India, Brazil, South Africa, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Uganda. And then clearly there are issues which cut across sectors, cut across regions, and many of these will be familiar to you. Questions of time horizons, systemic risk, governance, the mandates of regulators, the financial responsibilities of institutions, and incentives and information. On slide 13, I'm going to sort of the close really of my introductory remarks, is many people ask us, well, you have this window, this moment in time, what could success really look like? I think for us it would be if we can establish a credible vision of how the financial system can be positively linked to sustainable development, that we can work with policymakers and financial institutions, civil society and other stakeholders so that the sustainability agenda is on, sustainability issues are properly on the agenda of financial institutions, of financial regulators and so on. Obviously we need to have specific policy options for critical issues at the national and also at the international level. And then I think potentially have a role in helping to catalyze leadership. We've been very encouraged by the amount of people coming to us and seeking to work with us because they see this agenda, which is not exclusive to an inquiry by any means. This agenda is very, very timely. So that's, I think, some of the things we'd like to achieve when we wrap up and make our sort of final reports next year. As I mentioned, and this is slide 14, at the first United Nations Environment Assembly, which took place in June at the UN headquarters in Nairobi, we produced our sort of first invitation, which was the first presentation of the way we are looking at this challenge, our initial framing of it, and very much presents in short form and also in a longer background briefing the thought process which I just laid out to you. This is available on the web, on the inquiry website, and very much at this stage it is an inquiry. This is a process of discovery, and we have a series of questions that we are really looking for guidance from experts and practitioners. And I'd like to close, if I may, by just touching on some of these on the next slide. These were things maybe we could sort of start having a discussion with, and I'd like to also think about how maybe NSFM members could have a structured input into the inquiry. But these are some of the sort of the questions that we are puzzling with. Clearly, the financial system is a very dynamic system, and we don't want to design policy options for yesterday's financial system. So really interested in thinking about what are the disruptive factors that could shape the prospects for a sustainable financial system. For example, in 2020, what could be the social expectations, the technologies, the business models, etc. Clearly, one of the things about a sustainable financial system is not just going to be cleaner, but it's going to be longer term. And so how do we really tackle some of these very substantial embedded issues around short-termism, which we've had reports on, for example, by John Kay in the UK, the desire for longer-term approaches by institutional investors and sustainability. Often these three issues have been looked at separately in the past. If you look at actually the policy architecture at the international level, much of the policy is actually guided by principles because these are complex issues and the detailed implementation then happens at the national level. And so one of the thoughts we have, as I suggested earlier, is what principles really should be guiding this process of docking financial policy and regulation with sustainable development. Policy coherence, as I said earlier, was one of the three rationales for thinking about intervention in the financial system. And what are the architectures, again, at the national and international level, which actually do build joined-up policy making. Responsibilities of financial institutions is a key for us. Many of us have been working on the question within the investment world of fiduciary duty and how is it related to environmental social governance issues. I think we're seeing quite a lot of progress in that area. But I think, again, from the innovation we're seeing, the responsibilities of financial institutions can often go beyond questions of materiality and questions of fiduciary duty. And as I suggested in the case of banking regulations in some developing countries, there are now legal statutory requirements to have embedded environmental social risk procedures and systems. And one of the things, again, that we might think of as financial practitioners is what are the competencies that financial professionals would need to have to enable them to properly serve their clients in the transition to a green economy. Incentives clearly drive markets along with information. Clearly a lot of focus historically about remuneration policies, and I think a lot of concern now that these remuneration policies have unlinked the behavior of shareholders and corporations in the real economy, and many of the incentive policies we put in place are leading to a reduction in the investment we need for the long-term health of the real economy. As I mentioned, fiscal incentives focused on the financial system, very interested in that, getting a sense of the scale of incentives for savings and investment and banking, and looking and seeing how those could be properly aligned with sustainable development. Transparency and information, again, core focus for many, but also how can we use transparency really to strengthen market discipline around environmental social performance, and transparency not just of corporations through things such as the Sustainable Stock Exchange, but also transparency of financial institutions and also potentially regulators as well. These are issues which touch deeply on the economic prospects of different financial centres, and one of the things that we are very interested in is understanding the competitiveness implications of steps towards a sustainable financial system. Is this a case where there could be a race to the top in terms of financial centres, where financial centres see greater prospects in terms of attracting capital and business from developing competencies and rules and regulations that favour a sustainable financial system? And then clearly, in terms of a practical sense, we're interested in the sequencing of policies, the trade-offs of policies, and then also where are the potentials for coalitions and coalition building between financial institutions, with policymakers, and also with civil society. So I'd like to close there. The final slide is a picture of the leadership team of the inquiry, myself on the left, Nick Robbins, Simon Zadek, the other co-director, and then Mahanu Aga, who is the head of outreach. Thank you for listening and surviving so far, and I'd be delighted to take your questions and also suggestions of how you would like to get involved in this inquiry. Thank you very much.
Nick, thanks so much for that. So just as for those who have questions, if you're on the webinar itself, there's a chat box, which you should definitely feel free to type your questions or put your hand up. I saw Steve Peterman was perhaps someone with a question. Steve, are you wanting to ask your question? Are you unmuted?
Not at the moment. I'm fortunate I have to step out for a moment. I'll come back to you.
Oh, okay. Anyway, Kazutaka, if you can mute Steve. I think we're getting some background noise from him. Thank you. But I think I can ask a dual question, Nick, just to kick off the question, and if for some reason you want to ask a question and you're not on GoToMeeting, please send me an email if that's what it takes. But anyway, Nick, a quick question from here would be a dual question. Having spoken to Steve, I guess his thought is, within this effort, is there any thought being given to increasing investor awareness? I'm getting some background noise. I'm not sure why. It seems to be coming from. Anyway, so Nick, if you can hear me, is there any consideration to how can we increase investor interest in being part of this process in some way? Second would be from a U.S. perspective. when I think about policy and the UN, anything that's agreed in the COP process in Paris, would it be fair to say it needs to still be voted on by the U.S. population? In other words, even if the U.S. negotiators in Paris agree to a climate agenda, it still needs to be ratified by Congress. And so are there other political considerations to this process that might make sense to discuss as potential barriers?
Kerry, thanks very much for those questions. I'll deal with the question of investor awareness. We're very keen to work with groups that are already out there. So we're delighted to be working in collaboration with the Principles of Responsible Investment. On a project they are delivering and hopefully will be ready for their PRI in person in September this year, looking at the policy frameworks for responsible investment. I think you'll recall that within the PRI principles, there is a focus in one of the principles looking at what is the policy framework in terms of particularly financial policy and regulation that actually enables rather than disables responsible investment institutions. So we're working with that group, and so as the premier investor coalition in the world looking at responsibility in a sustainable financial system, that is one of the ways we hope to increase investor awareness of the importance of financial policy frameworks for their delivery of responsible investment. As I said, also at the national level, we will be seeking to involve investors in our work. In the case of the US, we've also already had meetings, not nationally, they're a big place, but in Boston and also New York, filling in some of the leading voices there, and certainly in our other engagements at the national level, we'll be very keen to pull in investors as well. But again, it'd be something given the network of sustainable financial markets reach and quality of relationship, that would be something we'd be very interested to see how maybe some awareness could be raised in broad circles. In terms of the sort of the negotiating process, I'm not an expert on the US constitutional requirements for a climate agreement. As I said, our work is we hope to be supportive of the climate change negotiations to show how a financial system could support the transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. But we're not directly linked to that. Those are separate negotiations with the UN framework for climate change. But again, we would agree this is where we want to work with people on the ground to really understand where this agenda about the game, where it fits in different countries. Clearly, in some aspects, the US has been a leader on this. I mentioned the SEC guidelines. I think the results that have come in series and others talk very much about the implementation of that and the take-up of the delivery on that by corporations in terms of their following the guidance. So we'd like very much to learn from that process. Any more questions?
Hi, Nick, can you hear me? This is Kerry. I was talking with myself. There's some background noise coming from someone, so if everyone could please be very conscious of the noise that might be in the background. I'm not quite sure where it's coming from. We're trying to mute everyone, so please self-mute yourself if it's possible. Nick, there's a couple of questions that have come through the chat box from Keith Johnson. One is, how will the inquiry relate to the short-term and pro-cyclical bias of accounting standards, and can NSFM help on this? Number two, has development and use of benchmarks by institutional investors surfaced as a priority issue? Are short-term and market-relative benchmarks a barrier or perhaps an opportunity?
As expected from a person such as Keith, two very, very good and penetrating questions. I think in terms of the accounting world, this is something that would be very good to seek your input and collaboration in terms of accounting standards. I think we are seeing the outcome of accounting traditions with very different trajectories, a sort of trading-focused accounting trajectory and one which is more about accountability. So it'd be very good for to think about how we can look at that. Clearly, there is a lot of work in the accounting reporting world ongoing, but where we can add value, given our limited time, very keen to work with practitioners on that. Certainly, benchmarks has emerged as an important issue, and that is something that we will be working on, notably in our work in Europe, with the 2 Degrees initiative we are working with.
Nick, this is Kerry. Can you hear me? Yeah, I was once again muted. Hazel Henderson has a question, which is as follows. Re-framework, are you starting from the assumption, as she does, that finance is a public utility, part of the global cultural commons since Bretton Woods?
Tried that, and then I go up.
Try it now.
Hello?
Nick,
Can you hear me now? This is Hazel Henderson. Hello?
Nick, are you still with us?
No, I can't seem to get in.
All right. Well, you'll just have to wait till we get to your question.
Although they're saying that I'm talking and I'm not.
No, you are. Hazel, can you hear me? This is Kerry.
Oh yes. Hi, Carrie. Yeah. I have been asked by Simon to come in on the scenarios, and the framework questions. And so that's why I put that question in the chat box, because we at Ethical Markets begin from the assumption that in the global economy now, that finance really is a public utility. And we base that on the fact that the platforms that are being used now all over the world are all taxpayer funded. The satellite communications, all the internet and all of that. And really this finance has been recognized as a part of the global cultural commons ever since Bretton Woods. So I just wondered, since I'm going to be jumping in to this on that scenarios level, that's where I want to start. And having people also remember that money is a unit of account. It has no value. It's a tracking system and a scoring system. So that's where I'm going to start.
Nick, are you still with us? We may have lost Nick. Okay, well, Hazel, thanks for that. I think we may have, in attempting to mute everyone, we may have either muted or lost Nick's having dialed in. Hoping we can resolve that shortly. Let's see if we can take a 2-minute break while we try to resolve for this. Kazutaka, if you're on the line, Nick says that he's been muted by us. Can you unmute him, please? Apologies to everyone. This is the first time we've run a webinar through GoToMeeting, and we're learning as we go, I suppose you could say. Nick, are you back on?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Great. Did you hear Hazel's question?
I heard Hazel's question, which is a great set of points. I think if you look at the financial, if you look at the financial system as a public utility, many things are revealed. I don't think that is how most people see it, and I think it's been seen as private assets operating with largely private-focused institutions. So I think that's a very helpful perspective. I also like the way you were thinking about the taxpayer-funded platforms. I think that is an under-examined aspect of the financial system. The amount of taxpayer support for financial institutions, whether in terms of guarantees of deposits, whether in terms of incentives for savings, investment, consumption, and also whether the implied subsidies for so-called too big to fail institutions. So I think that is something we would hope to analyze and reveal and show, therefore, that there are many public utility functions performed by the financial system, and these are indeed actually supported by fiscal measures. And therefore, how do we ensure that those fiscal measures are actually delivering public interest in terms of sustainable development? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Nick. Daniela Carosio has a question through the chat box, which is, at EU level, with whom are you negotiating, and which is the sensitivity of the EU regulator, which used to be high nowadays on these topics? I guess you meant, what in your view is the sensitivity from the EU regulator perspective these days?
I mean, we're just starting up our discussions at the EU level. And again, my sense, well, there is not one EU regulator. There are many regulators at the European level. There are obviously also a number of key policy institutions at the European Union level working on this matter. And then, of course, within the European Union, you have 28 member states. So it's a very complex policy arrangement. My sense is that there is an openness to these issues. I think it is interesting that the European Union, under Internal Market Commissioner Barnier, identified sustainability issues as one part of the overall financial reform package, leading to the non-financial reporting measures. And as many of you will know, there are some interesting next steps in terms of the corporate governance and shareholder rights directive, particularly in terms of disclosure from institutional investors of alignment with long-term interests of beneficiaries. So my sense so far is this, again, is an opportunity, and the key issue, obviously, for the European Union at the moment is to deliver a speedy economic recovery, and there, if you have an efficient financial system which is geared to long-term sustainable development, that would appear to be a very good opportunity for policy dialogue over the next year. It was very interesting to see that Commission President Juncker highlighted the potential for a capital markets union as one of the priorities of the next 4 years, and clearly Europe needs to move away from a banking dominated financial system to more focus on capital markets and institutional investors, and there again I would see substantial opportunity for ensuring that a capital markets union would be efficient, but also the links to long-term sustainable returns for savers and for the economy. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Next question's from Bill Bowie, which I'll read as quickly as I can. How are you defining sustainability and sustainable development? Specifically, are you integrating thresholds, or are you including more incrementalist approaches, for example, ESG? He asks because, in his view, SASB has stumbled in how it defines sustainability, with 3 different attempts so far that seem insufficient to him. His concern is that locking in incrementalism when we have the opportunity to set robust goal lines that align with a disciplined definition of sustainability. Give your view on that.
This is why it's great speaking to such an informed community as NSFM. It's great to be in contact with you, Bill, and thanks for your question. I think we are really evolving our perspective on how we deal with sustainable development. Clearly, we are very much within the framework of an understanding of local and planetary boundaries, I think that has been brought to the fore in the investment community, certainly by the work of Carbon Tracker in terms of unburnable carbon. So that is part of our frame of reference. Clearly, as we're also considering the issues in terms of the social dimension and the socio-economic dimension of sustainable development, where I think a sort of a thresholds approach doesn't obviously apply as well, but then obviously you have considerations around the implications of the financial system for the delivery and respect for human rights. So that is an aspect we're thinking of. But again, we want to not just look at a sort of a narrow, green, clean approach, but actually how you do put a financial system which is operating within the boundaries of a limited ecosphere, and also one that is clearly delivering in terms of priority social needs. And therefore, it's very exciting for us to be working at the same time that the UN and the Open Working Group are discussing a new set of sustainable development goals. So it's a very exciting moment in time.
Great, thanks, Nick. And Raj actually has a great question after that in the chat box.
Bill, hi, this is Kerry. I'll go for that. Thanks. I've been self-muting myself. There's been a bit of noise at times, and I'm overdoing the mute button. Anyway, so yes, the last question we have so far, and anyone still with a question, please feel free to send it in. But from Raj Thamotharam, Nick, is it within the remit of the inquiry to write to the chairs and/or CEOs of the leading gatekeepers and ask for a formal response on some critical issues relating to the particular gatekeeper? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the question is, by gatekeeper you mean financial regulator, and certainly that's something we can do. And we're already talking to a number of those gatekeepers in a very sort of cooperative and collaborative basis. So we intend to continue that both at the national level and the international level. And obviously, if the inquiry is successful, it's going to be in large part through working with others. As I said, we're a temporary initiative, and we obviously would need many different financial institutions. There's not one single gatekeeper or regulator to see that the sustainable development agenda is part of their mandate and focus.
Yeah,
again,
Raj has refined this question to make clear that what he meant by gatekeepers was CRAs, sell-side house, investment consultants, etc.
Okay. That's helpful, Raj. Thank you. We've been focusing, I suppose, quite a lot of our attention on the credit ratings side of things. We're very fortunate to have Neeraj Sahai, the CEO of Standard & Poor's, on our advisory committee, and I've had some very useful discussions there. So that is where we've been looking at to date in terms of that asset class, and clearly building on the work that's been going on within that market. And again, what should be the norms, standards, and rules and regulations that would make sustainable factors a normal part of the CRA process is the question we're asking.
Thanks, Nick. Just, I guess, if there's no other questions, just to maybe just to end on, well, first of all, thanks so much for your time. We at the network are excited about what you're doing. Could you repeat the deadline on the invitation at present? Because we certainly hope to engage as a network further with the inquiry.
There isn't a specific deadline. I mean, it's an open invitation through the length of the inquiry. I would say that your input would be very useful over, let's say, the next 2 months as we're building out. We're having quite a lot of focus on country-level work at the moment. But if there was initial thought over the next 2 months, let's say take us through to the end of September, that would be particularly useful. Earlier, the better, particularly in terms of, as we've heard today, some of the really leading edge perspectives, whether it's Hazel's perspective about utility function, or Raj on gatekeepers, or Bill on the issue of thresholds. So those would be useful maybe to have some sort of actually pretty rapid response from such a big community as NSFM about things that don't really focus on, but also things where people want to work with us, and where there maybe is opportunities for building on existing initiatives. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Our focus is not necessarily to innovate, but really to build on existing work that is already out there. So that would be great. So if people have some time over the Northern Hemisphere summer, it'd be great to maybe channel that and gather that, Kerry, through the network. And we can obviously discuss offline what would be a way of doing that. It'd be great in people's various communities to blog about this, to highlight where you think we're on track, where we're off track. That would be very, very helpful, and to get that conversation going in different places in different parts of the world.
Thanks so much, Nick. And also, Keith Johnson just wanted to know if Kazutaka can share the slides with anyone who's joined the webinar. If that's
of course. Please do.
That's great. Well, thanks so much. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks Nick so much, and best on your very important, essential efforts to working on this inquiry that hopefully we'll all have an opportunity to continue to discuss.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for the opportunity, and thanks for the great questions. I've already taken away a lot of insight. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, everyone.